Iran is a country that has had a wonderful civilization, a civilization endowed with poetry, with philosophy, with culture, with dance, everything to celebrate in humanity's creativity. But the human rights situation in Iran over the past 30 years has become a cause of increasing concern to the international community. This situation has affected all sectors of Iranian society: women, students, journalists, labor union organizers, members of religious and ethnic minorities, human rights defenders, political activists. Many groups in Iranian society today do not enjoy the rights that are their birthright as promised by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at whose monument we stand this evening. We're going to be focusing our thoughts on the situation of the Baha'i community of Iran, and even more specifically on the 7 men and women who've provided leadership and seen to the spiritual and social needs of the 300,000 Baha'is of Iran. But let us not forget all of the other people in Iran whose rights are being violated and who likewise suffer. And in our prayers, let us pray that the government of Iran recognizes that its honor and distinction and membership as a respected member of the international community depends upon its willingness to implement the full provisions of the human rights that are the birthright of every one of its citizens. From the inception of the Baha'i faith, when more than 166 years ago, the teachings of its founder, Baha'u'llah, captured the hearts and won the imagination of people of every nation, race, and creed around the world. And wherever they live, Baha'is have been welcomed and recognized for their commitment to work with their fellow citizens to create a society that is based on justice, where the material and spiritual well-being of all is safeguarded. This has not been the history of the Baha'i community in Iran. They have not been so recognized. And in fact, from the inception of the faith in Iran, the Baha'is of Iran have faced persecution, wave after wave of persecution. And in the late 70s, early 80s, with the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that persecution intensified. Initially, more than 200 Baha'is, many of whom had served in a leadership capacity, were executed or murdered. And when the outcry from the international community became too intense, the Iranian authorities changed their tactics, but not their goal, which was to eradicate the Baha'i community as a viable entity in Iranian society. They then pursued this by a wide range of human rights violations: arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, denial of access to higher education, denial of access to employment in the public sector, and severe restrictions on participation in the private sector, harassment, desecration of graveyards, denial of pensions, and a terrible campaign of vilification in government-controlled media, which left the population with no source of information about the Baha'i community, its practices and beliefs, other than the misrepresentations that were so blatantly told in the press. But the Baha'i community was not so easily suppressed. It continued. Its members in Iran, inspired by the vision of the oneness of humankind, committed to working with their friends and neighbors to build a just and prosperous society, did not lose heart. And so, in the spring of 2008, the Iranian government determined that its next step was to arrest the leadership of the Baha'i community. Now, I need to make a bracket and tell you that there is no clergy in the Baha'i community. And many of the functions that serve the social and material and spiritual needs of a religious community that are served by clergy in the Baha'i community are served by an elective body of believers who function as a consultative body. Who were these people that were arrested in the spring of 2008 and charged many months later, and never formally, but by an article in the press quoting the Prosecutor General, of such terrible things as espionage, actions against the national security of the country, the defamation and insult of Islam, conspiring with foreigners against the government, a host of accusations for which Shireen Ebadi, Nobel laureate, and on their legal team has said she has found not a shred of evidence in their files. Who were these people that withstood intense interrogation and refused to make a false confession that they had done any of these things, that they were anything but loyal and loving citizens trying their very best to serve their community? The first to be arrested was Mahvash Sabet, 57 years old, the mother of 2 grown children. She received her university education before Baha'is were banned from going to university, and became a qualified teacher, and then her work recognized, became a principal, and was even a member of the National Literacy Committee in Iran until the Islamic Revolution, at which point she lost her employment. What Mahvash did was work together with other Baha'is who'd been fired from their positions as university professors and helped found the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education, which tried under huge oppression to provide university-level education for Baha'i youth otherwise denied it. Then we go to Fariba Kamal Abadi, whose beautiful chant we heard, and it was all I could do to maintain my composure. Because when we hear the voice of Fariba Kamal Abadi chanting that prayer, and remember that for the past 28 months, it's the walls of Evan Prison that have heard that prayer, that have heard that voice. The injustice is almost too much to bear. Fariba has 3 children, the youngest a girl of 16 at home, waiting for her mother. She was university age when the Islamic Revolution happened, and she was denied access to university. In her mid-30s, she was able to enroll in the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education, and after 8 years of study, because the study is difficult because of the conditions under which that institute must operate, she obtained qualifications in developmental psychology. Next, we turn to Mr. Khanjani, Jamaluddin Khanjani, 77 years of age. He, along with his fellow prisoners, spent 105 days in solitary confinement in Evan Prison. Mahvash Sabet, who had been arrested 2 months earlier, spent 175 days in solitary confinement. And all of them have slept on a concrete floor with a blanket, no mattress, no bedding, no pillow, inadequate light, poor ventilation, inadequate exercise within the walls of that prison. Mr. Khanjani, father of 4, grandfather of 6, was arrested several times over the past many years. He was a member of the national governing body of the Baha'is of Iran in 1984, when 4 of the 9 members were executed. He had a brick-making factory in Tehran when the revolution started. It was the only one of its kind in Iran. It was automated, and it was closed down because he was a Baha'i. Later, he was able to start a small business selling agricultural equipment with help from some friends. The next person that I'd like to talk about is Mr. Afif Naimi, whose dream was to be a doctor. But he was not allowed to go to university because he was a Baha'i, and so he went to work in his father-in-law's business of textiles and blanket making. Mr. Afif Naimi, with many of the other of these 7 friends, did much volunteer work in the Baha'i community, providing classes for children and youth and adults. Mr. Saeed Rezai, who has 3 children. His youngest is a boy of 13. His son was 11 when his father was arrested and taken away to Evin prison. His son will be 21 if he serves that 10 years, which is the current sentence. Mr. Saeed Rezai is a noted scholar and has published many books on Baha'i topics. He spent 40 days in solitary confinement in prison in 2006. He was unable to gain employment in Tehran in the early years of the revolution, and so left and went north in Iran. And there he worked for a while as a manager on a farm, and then he was a carpenter. Mr. Behruz Tavakoli is 59 years old, and he has 2 grown sons, one of whom is a student of architecture at the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education, and the other of whom is here in Canada. Mr. Tavakoli qualified in psychology and then took further training in the care for developmentally delayed individuals, whether physical or intellectual delay. And he was working as a social worker at the beginning of the revolution, and he too lost his job because he was a Baha'i. He started a small carpentry millwork business in order to support his family. Some 3 years ago, he was in prison for 4 months, held without charge, and during that time he developed serious kidney and orthotic problems. And then we turn to Mr. Vahid Tisfam, a young man of 37 years whose child is an 11-year-old boy who's been without his dad at home since he was 9 years old. He's an optometrist, has a small optical shop. Each one of these prisoners have done everything that they can to serve their community, and the price that they are paying for this is their incarceration in Evin prison. But Roxana Sabari, of whom many of you may have heard, who was also in Evin prison, has said of the 2 women, Fariba Kamalabadi and Mavish Sabet, that their spirit, their confidence, their reliance on prayer, their happiness helped her to survive those days that she spent in Evin prison. As was said in the beginning of this program, these 7 Baha'is are innocent souls. Their imprisonment is an attack on the entire Baha'i community of Iran. And that attack is an attack on religious freedom, which is an inviolable right protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I leave you with the thought that it is essential that Iran be pressed and understand that it can and it must respect the human rights of every one of its citizens. And in this lies its future glory and accomplishment. Thank you very much.